If you could ask God any one question and you knew he would give you an answer right now, what would you ask him? What would you ask? Well, it may not be surprising, but by far, the number one questions that Americans ask is, why does God allow pain and suffering in the world? Does that surprise you? Didn't surprise me. You know, if you've never asked the question, why is there suffering? Why is there pain in the world? The chances are you will when it strikes you full force, or it strikes a loved one full force. And you know what? It's going to come. It's going to come. Jesus was honest. Jesus said, you're going to have suffering. Jesus said this in John 16:33. He said, you will have suffering in this world. You will. But why? All I could do would be to look at you and give you a 4-word answer. I do not know. I don't know. I don't know. I cannot stand in the shoes of God and give a complete answer to that question. I don't have the mind of God. I don't have the eyes of God. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 12 says, now we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror. But then we will see everything with perfect clarity. All I know now is partial and incomplete. But then I will know everything completely, just as God now knows me completely. So if you ask me, why do individual events of pain and suffering happen? Friends, honestly, in this world, you may not get a full answer. And frankly, if you're going through something like that today, if you're going through an era of your life with a lot of suffering and a lot of pain, then the last thing you really need is some theological treatise on pain and suffering. Because no amount of words are going to be sufficient for you. It's always going to sound trite when you're in the middle of suffering. What you need is the very real presence of Jesus Christ in your life. But having said that, and this is equally important, even though we can't understand everything about why we suffer, there are some things that we can know. Even though suffering is not good, God can use it to accomplish good. Now, you might hear that and you say, well, no, wait a second. Hold on. Let's not skim over that. I've gone through some horrific suffering in my life. I've gone through some awful pain in my life. And honestly, I don't think that God, even God, can find any good to emerge from the suffering that I've gone through. Friends, if that's the way you feel today, let me just remind you of one thing. And that is that God is so powerful and so good that he was able to take the worst possible thing that could ever happen in the history of the universe, which is deicide, the death of the Son of the God on a cross. He was able to take the worst thing that could ever happen and turn it into the best thing that has ever happened, which is the opening of heaven to all who follow him. And so you have to say to yourself, if God can take the worst possible thing that could ever occur and turn it into the best possible thing that could ever occur, could he not take my pain and my suffering and cause good to emerge? And the answer is, of course he can. Yes, he can, and he will. He will. He would use your suffering perhaps to draw you into a deeper and more intimate relationship with him. He may cause your suffering to point other people to salvation through Christ. He may use it to mold and to shape your character in ways that never could have been shaped had you not gone through that experience. There are a myriad number of ways that God can and he will cause good to emerge from your suffering if you are committed to following him. We decide whether we're going to turn bitter or turn to God for peace and courage. We make that decision. When tough times come, we're going to turn bitter or we're going to turn to God and receive peace and courage. We've all seen examples in our lives of how the same kind of suffering has a completely different effect on two different people. Some people become angry and bitter and turn inward because of the suffering they've gone through. And yet somebody else can go through the same kind of suffering and they come closer to God and closer to people and more loving and more tender. In other words, someone can lose a child to a drunk driver and turn inward with rage and bitterness for the rest of their life. But someone else has a child lost to a drunk driver, and they go out and they start Mothers Against Drunk Driving. One philosopher said this to me. He said, Lee, I believe all suffering is at least potential good, an opportunity for good. He said, it's up to our free choice to actualize that potential. He said, not all of us benefit from suffering and learn from it because it's up to us. It's up to our free will. So we make the choice. Are we going to run away from God or are we going to run to God? So let me finish that quote that I started this message with, because I only quoted part of this verse, John 16:33. I want to put it into context now. The entire verse says this: I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. You will have suffering in this world, but be courageous. I have conquered the world. In other words, he offers us in the midst of our suffering the two very things we need the most. He offers us peace for the present and courage for the future. How? Because he's conquered the world. Because through his own suffering and through his death, he has deprived the world of having ultimate power over you. Suffering does not have the last word anymore. Pain does not have the last word anymore. God has the last word. Jesus is the last word. You see, God's ultimate answer to suffering is not just an explanation, it is the incarnation. Suffering is a personal problem. Therefore, God sent a personal solution in Jesus Christ. God is not some distant and disinterested deity. He, through Jesus Christ, entered into our pain, entered into our suffering. And Psalm 34, verse 18 says this: the Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and he saves those who are crushed in spirit. This wise philosopher that I got to sit down with said this to me at a time in my life when I was going through some tough times. He said, Jesus is there in the lowest places of our lives. He said, are you broken? Jesus was broken like bread for you. Are you despised? Jesus was despised and rejected of men. You cry out that you can't take it anymore? Jesus was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Did someone betray you? Jesus was sold out for 30 pieces of silver. Are your tenderest relationships broken? Jesus loved and he was rejected. Do people turn from you? Well, guess what? They hid their faces from him like he was a leper. Does he descend into your deepest hells? Yes, he does. In fact, from a Nazi concentration camp, Corrie ten Boom wrote these words: no matter how deep our darkness, he is deeper still. He is deeper still. Every tear we shed becomes his tear. And then the wise man said this to me. He said, it's not like God just sympathizes with you like a close friend would. Any close friend, if you're going through pain and suffering, any close friend of yours is going to sit on the couch next to you and is going to put their arms around you and is going to empathize and sympathize with you. That's true of any friend. But he said, if Jesus is in you, if you are his child, he is inside of you. And if he is inside of you, he is closer to you even than your closest friend. And therefore, your sufferings become his sufferings, and your sorrow becomes his sorrow. And so, friends, when tragedy strikes, and it will, or when pain comes into your life, and you know it will, then you have a choice to make. Do I turn away from God and turn bitter? Or do I turn to God and find hope and peace and courage? Peace for the present, courage for the future.
Here's the first question from a student here in America. How can a God of all power and all love allow for evil in this world, especially if he knew in advance that the world would fall apart after he created it, and we would have atrocities and the sickness and the suffering that we have?
I think, John, this is the thorniest question, truly the one that probably most people ask. Someone put it in these words: virtue in distress and vice in triumph has made atheists of mankind. Or what Alfred Lord Tennyson said, never more to morning wore to evening, but that some heart did break. It is a painful question in itself because it deals with pain. Pain is a real thing. It's not an imaginary thing. There are many ways that one can approach an answer, but C.S. Lewis used to remind us that it is critically important to examine the assumptions within a question. And I remember years ago at the University of Nottingham, when I'd finished a talk, when a person stood up, or a student stood up and shouted from the floor, and he said, there's too much of evil in this world. There can't be a God. There's too much of evil and suffering in this world. And the irony of that question to me was, I come from the East, I now live in the West. I don't ever remember being asked this question in the East. Now they do because of all the cross-pollination of thinking and all of that. But it's hardly ever addressed. In Islam, you hardly ever find a book dealing with this subject. It's inshallah, it's the will of Allah, And in the pantheistic system, it's karma, you're paying your debt and so on. It's in the Western world where we actually live with the greatest comforts that we raise the question about pain and suffering. But this Englishman raised it, and I said to him, why don't I make it clear first why you are asking this question and what your assumptions are. I said, when you say there's evil, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as good? He paused and he said, yes. I said, when you say there's such a thing as good, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil? He struggled with this and we interacted, and finally he said, yeah, there would have to be an objective moral standard from which to differentiate between good and evil. I said, when you say there's a moral law, you must posit a moral lawgiver, but that's whom you're trying to disprove and not prove, because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What is your question? And he looked at me, paused, and he said, what then am I asking you? Now, this was years ago. I said, I know what you're asking, man. I'm not trying to make it hard for you. It's an existentially felt question that often doesn't examine the logical presuppositions within this. God has to remain in the paradigm for the question to be real, and therefore the answer has to come from what God's purposes and what God's description is all about reality. In a recent book that I co-authored with Vince Vitale, my colleague from Oxford, we called it Wise Suffering. My opening chapter was what is called the trilemma. God is all-powerful, God is all-loving, and there is evil. That's the trilemma. The three realities that J.L. Mackie, the Australian philosopher, says are incoherent. God is all-powerful, God is loving, evil exists. He says it's an incoherence. So my question is, why is it a trilemma and not a quadrilemma or a quintilemma? Introduce one more. God is all-knowing. That's also a belief we have. And number 5, God is eternal. God is not judging everything just in time. There's an eternity. So it's not just the question is stacked when it's stacked as a trilemma. God is also all-knowing, and eternity also exists as a reality. And maybe those explanations can come in eternity. Let me just move to 2 quick answers in this. There's a young gal in Georgia, where I live. I live in Atlanta. And her first name is Ashlyn. And one day her mother was on a television program discussing a strange problem that she has, which is called CIPA, congenital insensitivity to pain with anhidrosis. She cannot feel pain and her sweat glands don't work. The problem may sound good, you don't feel any pain, but the reality is if she steps on a nail while she's on the sports field, it could puncture the skin, create an infection, and nobody could be even aware of it. The mother said the problems it has created in her life for what this malady brings into her body. She says, I pray one prayer every night. God, please let my daughter help to feel pain. She could put her hand on a burner and not know that her hand is burning. Now, my question is this. if in our finite existence we can see the role of pain to warn us that something is wrong, is it impossible for God in His infinite wisdom to allow pain in our lives to help us know that something is wrong? Pain is spelt with moral connotations in the human framework. That is because we are moral beings. Therefore, the answer has to come from within a moral, spiritual framework as well. The question assumes moral reasoning, and that can only be assumed if God is in the paradigm, not outside of it.
I have given this talk only twice before, and in both cases, the Lord revealed how relevant it was very quickly. And it's this, especially to pastors, are you preparing your people for suffering? Otherwise, many Christians are going to suffer who are totally unprepared for it. And our responsibility as pastors and teachers is to prepare our people for suffering. And especially here in Singapore, everything is so wonderful and so normal that you could forget to do this. But as we get nearer the end of the age, the wheat and the tares are both going to grow towards maturity, and there is certain to be more tension between them. Just what form it'll take, we'll have a word or two later about that. But here in Singapore, I believe it's the duty of every pastor to prepare their people for suffering. Christians will suffer in this world more than other people. We will suffer the normal things that happen in life. There's no escape from those. We're not specially protected or insured against that. And as human beings in a fallen world with natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, famines, we're bound to be caught as others are. Things like cancer, old age, and certainly death itself don't bypass Christians. We shall face that. Of course, we hope Christ will get back before we reach the end of our earthly pilgrimage. It's getting a little close for me at 83, and with all that's to happen before Christ's coming, that is still predicted in the Bible, I don't think I'm going to be alive when Jesus gets back. Incidentally, on that score, the Bible is the one history book that tells you how everything is going to end. We're the only people in the world who are forewarned and told to be ready. There are altogether 735 separate predictions about the future in the Bible, of which 596 have already been fulfilled, literally, exactly as foretold, which means about 81% of all the predictions in the Bible have already happened. And of those that remain, most are concerned with the end of the world. And that certainly hasn't happened yet, so it's still future, or we wouldn't be here. Of the prophecies that have to be fulfilled before Jesus gets back, there are less than 20. But that's still quite a number to be fulfilled. If you want to know what they are, there's a very fine book called The Dictionary of Biblical Prophecy by a man called J. Barton Payne. I'll give you his name and the book title later if you want it. But that's one of the best books that I've come across that lists every prediction in the Bible and its fulfillment, and a very balanced interpretation of each that's yet to come. So we can expect it. We are Christians in a godless world. We are aliens. We are social misfits. We no longer belong here. We're citizens of heaven, and therefore clashes with citizens of earth and with a world that's fallen are inevitable and are to be expected. 1 John 5:19 says, "We know we are children of God, and that the whole world is under the control of the evil one." We know that, but we don't really think about it. And we go about our own world, especially in a place like Singapore, without thinking about it. From one week to the next, we're comparatively comfortable as Christians in a city like this. That's not true, not very far away. So the first point I want to make is that suffering is normal for the Christian. It's not abnormal. The normal Christian life is a life of suffering. As Peter says in his letter, "My dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery trial or ordeal which comes upon you to prove you, as though something unusual was happening to you." It is not unusual for a Christian to suffer. In fact, I'd go so far to say that the New Testament is written for people who are suffering. That's how normal it is.